A poor girl sat alone at the shelter gate. What the billionaire heard left his face went pale. "Where do kids go when nobody wants them anymore, sir?" That was the first sound that reached me on a silent winter night. A small, trembling voice carried on the frigid air like the call of a lost bird against a sky washed in white. Before the story begins, thank you for visiting Little Lantern, a place where we can pause for a moment, breathe a little slower, and let the world soften just long enough to hear the heartbeat of a child. That night, I, Ethan Monroe, a 58-year-old businessman, was on my way back to a temporary apartment in downtown Denver after a long day of meetings at the investment firm I founded. The city was blanketed in thick snow, and every sound seemed muffled beneath the shimmering streetlights. I slowed the car as I passed a corner I rarely noticed. It used to be the site of the Shelter Street Center, a small place that once gave refuge to children without homes. Now, that building stood silent. The iron gate was locked with a rusted chain, and its sign hung crookedly, the faded letters barely visible under the weak light. I knew why it had been shut down. Last year, during a strategic meeting, we decided to cut funding for several community programs. Shelter Street was among them, just a line in a report, a signature of mine beneath a budget chart. I should have kept driving, as I often did with things that fell outside my sphere of influence. But as my eyes swept past that old gate, I noticed a small shape sitting beside it, almost blending into the snow. At first, I thought it was a trash bag or a pile of discarded fabric. But then the shape moved, and a small head lifted. I saw the face of a young boy, his wide eyes beneath hair matted with frost, clutching a worn-out backpack so tattered I thought it might fall apart at any moment. I stopped the car, not because I knew what to do, but because I couldn't keep going. I stepped out. The crunch of my shoes against the snowy sidewalk rang sharply through the quiet. Wind slipped through the collar of my coat, its cold biting into my bones. But the boy wore only a thin shirt, its sleeves frayed at the edges, and oversized shoes with the toes worn down to near nothing. His small hands, red and raw from the cold, held tightly onto that old backpack as if it were the last thing in the world he could still claim as his own. I crouched beside him and asked softly, "What are you doing here?" He looked up. His voice was barely louder than a breath in the mist. "My name is Sam. My mum said there would always be someone here to help. She said if I came here, the door would open." I turned my eyes to the gate. Locked, cold and silent, just like the decision I had signed a year ago. No lights, no voices, no warmth. I asked, "Where are your parents?" Sam didn't answer. He looked down and hugged the backpack, tighter, a quiet and painful way of saying no more. Before I could speak again, a sharp voice came from across the street. "You can't sit there. Move along. This is an office zone, not a dumping ground." A security guard from the building nearby marched over, flashlight in hand, voice harsh and indifferent. Sam shrank back, as though he had long grown used to being told to move, to leave, to disappear from places where he didn't belong. I stepped between the boy and the man. "I'll take care of this," I said, my voice low but steady. The man looked me over, gave a faint scoff, then walked away. When he was gone, I turned back to Sam. He was still sitting there, staring at the old door like it might open simply because he needed it to. But the door stayed closed, and the wind stayed cold, and the world kept turning, as if no one had ever waited outside it. I held out my hand. "Come on, let's find somewhere warmer." Sam hesitated, then slowly stood, his small legs shaking on the snow-covered ground. He walked carefully, each step light and cautious, as though afraid to disturb the path beneath him. As though he had long since learned to make himself smaller, I didn't know what I was doing. All I knew was that something in that first question refused to let me go. Where do the children no one wants go? That night, I brought that question home with me. But in truth, it was the question that took me somewhere I never expected to go. A journey that began with a locked door and a little boy who had nowhere left to go. Thank you for staying with us this far, here at Emotional Echoes. If Sam's story has stirred something within your heart, consider subscribing to the Emotional Echoes YouTube channel so you won't miss any of the deeply moving and human stories we share each day. And if this story has touched you, please take a moment to like and share the video so that warmth like this can reach even more hearts. Where are you listening from? Drop a comment below with the name of your city or state so we can see just how far these simple yet stirring moments are traveling across America. Now, let us return to where we left off. To the moment Sam first climbed into the car of a stranger who just might have been the only one who chose to stay. Sam followed me with slow, hesitant steps, as if each footfall needed permission from the ground beneath it. He still clutched that old backpack tightly, the zipper long gone, the fabric at the bottom so frayed that a single tug might have torn it open completely. I held the car door open for him, but he hesitated for quite some time, his gaze drifting back to the darkened Shelter Street center behind us, as if he were waiting for someone to call him back. Inside the car, the warmth gently filled the space, but for Sam, stepping into it must have felt like entering a different world, one too kind, too unfamiliar, so kind that a child used to being, turned away, could only approach it with caution. At last, he climbed into the back seat. When the door closed behind him, I heard a soft exhale, the kind of breath someone takes after being cold for too long and trying to believe that warmth might still be real. I started the car and pulled away slowly. Sam sat perfectly still, arms wrapped tightly around the backpack as though it were a talisman. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were not the eyes of a 6-year-old. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too many doors close. I tried to say something to break the silence that was slowly thickening between us. "Have you been there long, Sam?" He flinched slightly, then whispered, "A long time." I was waiting for the door to open. My mum said it never closes. That sentence made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Somewhere in an internal report, we had used words like inefficient and in need of restructuring, and with that extinguished a place that children like Sam once believed was their final refuge. Sam rubbed his eyes, trying to hide the trembling in his voice. I thought if I waited long enough, someone would open the door. I didn't know how to answer that. All I could say was a single line. It should have been that way. The car turned onto a quiet street, and the streetlights cast long, moving patterns across the windshield. Sam turned to look out the window, his eyes trailing the glow of homes he may never have thought he could enter. When we stopped in front of a small diner on the corner, I turned and said, "Let's go in and warm up a bit." Sam opened the door slowly, staying close to my side as we stepped in. The chime above the door rang, drawing the attention of a few customers. They looked Sam over from head to toe, not with outright cruelty, but with enough coldness that a child could feel he didn't belong. Sam immediately moved closer, almost hiding behind the hem of my coat. I walked to the counter and placed a bill down, more than necessary, just to avoid any unpleasantness. The diner owner glanced at Sam once more, then gave a small nod and motioned for us to take a seat. I chose a booth near the wall, away from prying eyes. Sam sat down, placing both hands on his knees, still slightly trembling. A server brought out a bowl of hot soup. As the steam rose, Sam stared at it like it was something rare and distant. He reached out, touching the edge of the bowl to warm his fingers before daring to pick up the spoon. He ate very slowly, each small spoonful cautious, as if eating too quickly might make it disappear. I watched him, the feeling in my chest both unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Not because of the boy himself, because I couldn't understand why a child had to eat as though he didn't know if there would be another meal. Halfway through, Sam set the spoon down and looked up. "I don't want to be a bother." I just needed to wait for the door to open. His voice was so quiet, I had to lean in to hear him clearly. "You're not a bother, Sam. You're cold. You're hungry. You have every right to sit in a warm place like this." He nodded, but I could still see the watchfulness in his eyes. A 6-year-old should never know how to guard himself from the world this well. I asked him, "Do you know where to go if that center is closed?" Sam shook his head. "I only knew about that place. My mom said someone would help if I came here." I could hear the wind in those words, sharp and echoing. Just then, Sam hugged the backpack to his chest. "What's inside?" I asked. He gripped the strap tightly and whispered, "Everything I have left." That answer landed on my shoulders like the full weight of winter. I looked across the table at the thin, red-eyed boy, worn down by cold and waiting, and I knew that tonight I could not take Sam back to another locked door. At Shelter Street, the wind would still be passing through the chained gate, but this time I could not turn away. And I understood, the moment I reached forward to steady the soup bowl so Sam wouldn't spill it, that I had stepped into a story from which there was no turning back. That night, after Sam finished his last spoonful of soup and drifted off by the window of the small diner, his head resting gently against that battered old backpack, I called a car and brought him back to my spare apartment near downtown. The place had always served as a stopover during business trips to Denver, compact, modern, more like an upscale hotel than a true home. I couldn't remember the last time anyone besides me had stepped inside. Sam fell asleep almost instantly, still clinging to his backpack as if it were the only safe blanket in a world that had no place for him. I stood just outside the bedroom door, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the small figure curled tightly on a clean bed, his limbs never stretching out, his body never relaxing the way children do when they feel safe. I returned to the office, switched on the light, opened my laptop out of sheer habit. The screen lit up with internal reports, payroll records, financial charts, and a long list of upcoming meetings. For nearly 3 decades, I had lived inside those numbers. I could read market movement in the angle of a single curve on a graph, predict investor moods by the tightness of a jawline in a boardroom, and had made decisions worth millions within minutes of glancing at a financial summary. Ethan Monroe. That name had once appeared in business magazines as a symbol of precision and strategic coldness. They called me the man of emotionless decisions. And maybe they were right. I had built Crestview Capital from a 2-person basement office into a financial firm operating across 8 states. At every step, I learned to treat emotion as a burden that slowed progress. I never remarried after my first divorce, had no children, no close family. I took pride in being able to sign off on hundreds of documents a week without hesitation. In my world, delay was synonymous with failure, and I had never failed. But now, standing alone in a room flooded with sterile white light, reports open in front of me, I could feel something cracking deep inside the logic I had once believed was bulletproof. Shelter Street. The name appeared clearly in a document nearly a year old. A community program that generated no revenue, with high operating costs, flagged for potential cuts. I read the description, glanced at the figures, and signed off. The decision was recorded as routine. There were no pictures of children attached, no names like Sam, just a line that read, "No longer aligned with the company's growth strategy." And now, the boy sleeping in the room next to mine was the consequence I had never seen reflected in any spreadsheet. I didn't know how to care for another person. I wasn't used to being needed by anyone outside of office hours. My life was neatly ordered, with a schedule that left no room for stray variables. Each morning I woke at the same hour, brewed the same coffee, sat in the same seat in the same car, followed the same route to the office where people passed me with cool respect. But tonight, a new rhythm pulsed through that structure. the breath of a child I could not leave outside my door. I looked at the clock. Near midnight. My inbox blinked with over 20 unread emails. I shut the laptop. For the first time in years, I left a task unfinished and felt no guilt. I stood, walked quietly down the hall to where Sam was sleeping. He still clutched his backpack, murmuring in his dreams as if whispering to someone who was no longer there. And I, a man who once believed he could calculate every risk, now stood weighted by something immeasurable, the feeling of responsibility. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain. My life had changed, not because of a billion-dollar deal, but because of the eyes of a child who once believed no one would ever open the door for him. And I, the man behind the numbers, felt for the first time that maybe I was the one who needed a door to open. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The pale light of early winter slipped through the glass windows, casting long streaks across the cold wooden floor. The apartment remained still, everything held in its familiar order, except for a faint sound coming from the other room. I could hear the soft rustling of a child turning in sleep, the quiet rhythm of steady breathing, and I realized this silence was different from all the other mornings before it. This silence had weight, as if quiet itself could press against the chest in ways that were invisible, yet deeply felt. I made coffee as I always did, standing by the window, watching the sparse stream of cars slide through the frozen streets of Denver. Mornings like this were usually the time I would check emails, scan market indicators, schedule meetings for the coming week. But today, I simply stood there, a cup of coffee in hand, my mind blank. I couldn't stop thinking about Sam, about the look in his eyes as he stared at that locked gate the night before, about what he said as he sat before a steaming bowl of soup. I just needed to wait for the door to open. I sat down and opened my laptop, pulling up the old document on the Shelter Street program. The title was still there. Proposal for budget reduction due to above-average operational costs. Below that were notes from the finance department. No names, no stories, just numbers, charts, and logic stripped of all humanity. I remembered that meeting clearly. We had sat around a long wooden table, each person speaking in an even tone, eyes fixed on the projected screen. Someone had remarked that centers like Shelter Street were consuming too many resources without producing measurable commercial value. The phrase used was long-term inefficiency. I nodded. No questions. No objections. It was a decision made in minutes, no different than hundreds of others I had approved before. But what I hadn't seen, what no chart had shown me, was the image of a 6-year-old boy curled up beside an iron gate, clutching a worn backpack, waiting for something the world had long stopped offering. My life, for decades, had been a string of well-ordered days. Everything quantifiable. Success was measured in profit. Influence was tracked through growth metrics. And community programs, if they didn't return visible reputation points, were often first in line for elimination. I never thought of myself as unfeeling. I was simply used to believing that emotion didn't belong in a quarterly report. And yet now, rereading those cold lines of text, I felt as though I was staring into a space that no longer recognized me. I walked to the bedroom door. Sam was still asleep, curled into himself, lips pressed gently together, one hand resting on his backpack as if afraid it might disappear while he dreamed. Perhaps to him, that bag was past and present all at once. Everything his mother had left him. The one place where he kept the hope that someone might still remember he existed. I closed the door quietly and returned to my desk. Something inside me shifted, just a little, but enough to make me no longer care about opening emails, no longer interested in planning another week. I only wanted to know who Sam's mother was, what had happened, and how a child could be left behind at the very gate that had once been built to welcome him. The silence in the apartment no longer felt like the quiet I once prized. It wasn't the same as those solitary mornings I used to wear like a badge of discipline and success. Today, that silence was heavier. It pressed into the corners of the room, lingered in the air, as if it carried weight, because now I knew that a part of me had played a role in locking that door, and I had been the one holding the key, never realizing that on the other side of the gate, small eyes were waiting for someone like me to turn back. I didn't know where to begin to make things right, but for the first time in many years, the numbers on my screen no longer gave me comfort. Silence, when it holds guilt, is louder than any noise. And this morning, I realized I had lived far too long inside that kind of silence. Sam woke to the smell of toast drifting from the small kitchen in the apartment. I had been up for hours, but instead of dressing in a suit and heading out the door as usual, I had stood at the stove, brewing coffee, toasting bread, and setting 2 bowls of reheated soup on the table. When I turned around, Sam had quietly stepped out of the back room, his hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. He said nothing, just stood there for a moment, clutching his backpack to his chest, as though waiting for me to confirm that he hadn't wandered into the wrong place. I pulled out a chair and gestured for him to sit. He looked at me for a moment, then walked slowly toward the table, placing the backpack in his lap and leaning back against the chair, keeping a safe distance. I handed him a spoon, nodded toward the soup, no words needed. Sam looked at the bowl for a long moment, then picked up the spoon and began to eat, small spoonfuls, not rushed, but with a quiet reverence. We sat like that for a while, neither of us breaking the silence, only the soft sound of spoon against bowl and the faint tapping of morning rain against the window. Sam didn't ask who I was or why he was here, maybe because he was used to questions not having answers. Or maybe he was waiting to see if I would still be there after one night. I wasn't sure, but I knew the silence he carried held more meaning than many spoken words. After some time, I asked gently, "Do you want to tell me about your mother?" Sam paused, looking up at me. His eyes held no anger, no blame, only waiting, as if that question had been waiting quietly in his heart for someone, anyone, to ask. "Her name was Gloria," he said, his voice light as breath. "She used to sing at night. Back when we lived in the old apartment, she'd light candles and read to me whenever it rained. She worked at a laundromat, but then she stopped going when she got sick." I listened without interrupting. Sam went on. "When she was in pain, I'd bring warm water and sleep beside her. One time she told me that if I was good, then no matter what happened, everything would be okay." I saw the tension in his small hand holding the spoon. He stopped, then reached into his backpack. From inside he pulled out a stuffed bear, worn down, fur thinning at the ears, one eye missing. Sam placed it on the table, gently smoothing it with his fingers, as if soothing something fragile and dear. "This is Brownie. Mom gave it to me when I turned 5. When she couldn't get up anymore, she told me to take Brownie with me." I looked down at the bear, and something tightened in my throat. Sam spoke without tears. But I knew that was how a child holds on to dignity, not because he wasn't sad, but because he had learned that sadness doesn't always change anything. I walked for many days. When I was hungry, I ate crackers. When I was thirsty, I asked for water at gas stations. Mom wrote the address for Shelter Street on a piece of paper and told me that if there was no one else, I should go there. She said they wouldn't turn me away. I asked him, "Where's that piece of paper now?" Sam opened a small pocket inside his backpack and pulled out a crumpled scrap, the ink faded by water. I looked at the shaky handwriting. Beneath the words naming the Shelter Street Center was a smaller line, barely legible. "Believe that good people still exist." I said nothing. I didn't know whether I was hurting more for Sam or for the blindness in myself, the man who had once signed away things like this, without ever seeing who would be left on the other side. Sam gently tucked Brownie the bear back into the backpack and zipped it shut with care. Then he looked up and asked me in a voice that barely reached across the room, "Do you know why they locked the center?" I looked into his eyes and couldn't answer, because I had been the one holding the key, and now any lie would only deepen the cold already settling in my chest. So I shook my head and said quietly, "I don't know why it was locked, Sam, but I do know it never should have been." He looked at me for a while, then nodded. No smile, no reply. But in his gaze there was a faint glimmer. Something like trust. Fragile, yes, but strong enough to keep a closing door from shutting all the way. Sam sat on the rug near the window, the afternoon light falling in slanted lines through the soft rain, casting a quiet glow over his face as he bent forward and opened the old backpack. I sat a few feet away, not too close, not too far, just close enough for him to know I was listening, but not so close as to intrude. The apartment was still. Only the sound of rain tapping gently against the glass and the soft scrape of the zipper as Sam slowly unfastened each pocket like he was unlocking a small treasure chest. He pulled out Brownie first, placing the bear beside him with a carefulness that suggested this was a ritual he'd performed many times before. Then came a worn handkerchief, neatly folded. Next, a crumpled envelope, with no stamp, no return address. Sam opened it and took out a photograph. He held it out to me. In the photo was a woman in her early 30s with softly curled hair, gentle eyes, and arms wrapped around a small child I guessed was Sam, back when he was very little. Behind them was a park, a wooden bench, and a scattering of pale flowers. The corner of the picture had smudged, but the mother's face remained clear enough for me to see the quiet exhaustion she tried to hide behind her smile. Mom said this photo was the only thing she wanted me to keep, besides Brownie. Sam spoke with a steady, quiet voice. She told me that if I ever got lost, all I had to do was look at this picture and remember her smile, and I wouldn't be scared anymore. He carefully folded the photo and slipped it into a small plastic sleeve, handling it as if even breath could blur it further. Then he pulled out a few more papers. Some were old receipts, others were handwritten notes, temporary housing slips, an unfinished aid application, the mother's handwriting shaky and tired, each line bearing the exhaustion of someone trying with everything they had left. Many were smudged from water, the edges torn as if they'd been stuffed into the backpack in the middle of a rainstorm or during a hasty move. Sam didn't speak again. He simply arranged each piece in the same careful order he had always kept. There weren't many, not even 10 items. But each was a fragment of memory, a piece of a life. I didn't ask why there weren't clothes or books or anything else. I understood. When someone packs their entire world into a small backpack, they take what can be carried not by weight, but by the heart. Sam ran a hand gently across the folded handkerchief, his small fingers trembling, whether from the cold or from something deeper. "I have a letter from my mom, too." But it got wet. The words disappeared. He pulled out a torn slip of paper, the writing barely legible. Only a few lines remained, one part still clear. "If someone finds my son, please help him stay somewhere with a window and sunlight." That's what I want most. I felt something inside me sink, as if something had quietly broken inside my chest. A wish so simple it hurt. I stood and went into the kitchen, poured a warm glass of milk. When I came back, Sam had already packed everything back into his backpack, zipped it up carefully, and rested it on his lap like it was the only shield he had left in the world. "Everything I have is in this bag." Sam said it without looking up, and the words echoed in my mind more than in my ears. Not because of how little he had, but because this 6-year-old had already learned how to fold his past, his present, and every ounce of hope into one small canvas bag. I set the glass of milk beside him. Sam took it, pressing his hands around the cup to warm them. He didn't say thank you, but I knew when a child has lost so much, silence can be a form of gratitude too. I sat beside him, my hand resting lightly on the table. I didn't look at the clock. I didn't check my phone. I just looked at Sam and that backpack. And I knew from this moment forward, the only thing that mattered was making sure that everything inside that bag would no longer be everything he had. I wanted him to have more to hold on to, a home, a new photo, another letter, a memory he didn't have to clutch just to keep from losing, because no child should ever grow up believing that all they're allowed to keep can fit inside one old bag. That evening, after Sam had drifted into sleep, the small backpack cradled in his arms and the worn brownie bear tucked beneath his head, I sat alone in the small home office. The soft yellow glow of the desk lamp spilled across the surface, where printed financial reports still lay untouched, the weight of them somehow heavier now than paper should ever feel. The computer screen remained lit, but I no longer looked at the numbers. I looked at my own reflection in the window's glass, at a face that had changed with time without my noticing. I had always believed that a good executive needed the ability to make firm decisions, unswayed by emotion. In the early years of building Crestview, I had been proud of my capacity to act within 5 minutes, never hesitating. As the company grew, I honed that instinct, learning to leave compassion at the door of the boardroom. There was no room for personal stories in financial meetings, no place for children like Sam in the balance sheet. But now, as I turned back to a memo titled Times Budget Restructuring Proposal, Quarterly Review *, I saw the line in bold type, *, terminate funding for Shelter Street Center *. Below it were the cost-benefit analyses, the efficiency graphs, the statistics. I had signed on the last page, one swift, practiced stroke of the pen. I remembered that afternoon clearly. After signing, I went to lunch with the CFO, and we discussed expanding into another state. I couldn't recall ever asking how many people that decision would leave without a place to return to. I had never met the staff at Shelter Street, never heard the cry of a child locked out on a cold night. To me, it had been a budget line. But now, with Sam sleeping just a few steps away, his small hands wrapped tightly around that bag like a soldier guarding his final post, I understood that my signature had taken something I could never give back. I opened the archive folder. There were 3 more centers listed in the cuts, one in the outskirts of Seattle, another in Kansas City, and one more in a rural county in southern Ohio. I began to wonder how many children like Sam had sat by a locked gate, how many mothers like Gloria had sent their children out into the world with a handwritten note, believing someone kind would be there to catch them. I had never imagined a signature could carry so much weight. It made no sound as the pen touched paper, but its echo, given enough time, would always return on a night like this, in a quiet room where no one was left to hear it but the conscience of the one who signed. Sam shifted gently in his sleep. I heard the soft rhythm of his breathing, and something inside me tightened, not out of pity, out of regret. A feeling that charts cannot measure, that no report can capture. But it was real as the beat of a heart growing heavier with every passing thought. I once told colleagues that to lead a company far, one must be willing to make sacrifices, but no one ever asked who the sacrifices were, what their names were, how many faces, how many cold, restless nights, how many stuffed bears held tight like the last fragile wall between a child and the world. That night, I couldn't sleep. I simply sat there, hand resting on the table, eyes fixed on the page I had signed. I could no longer read the words. My vision had blurred, and all I could see was the weight of it. And in that quiet, I understood the only thing I could do now was to make sure that decision would not be the last thing I left behind in the life of a child. I couldn't undo everything, but I could begin with one thing, to reopen the door I had once ordered closed, not for profit, not for reputation, But for a boy who had carried his entire world in a cloth bag, waiting outside, hoping anyone would open the door and let him in. The next morning, as the thin light of dawn slipped through the faded curtains of the apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with a cooling cup of coffee in my hand, eyes on the door that stood slightly ajar, behind which Sam was still sleeping. I had never been easily moved by fleeting emotions. But after a long, sleepless night, not a single hour passed without one question pressing deeper into me: what would happen if I turned away just one more time? Sam didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I was the one who had signed away the place he had been told to trust. And yet, somehow, when I opened the car door and reached out my hand, he took it without asking why. Maybe trust isn't always something that has to be earned. Maybe sometimes it's simply given out of hope. Sam stepped out from the room, his hair tousled, still holding his backpack as if it were a part of him. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, then pulled out a chair and sat at the table. He didn't ask about breakfast, didn't request anything. He was used to not asking. I placed a plate of eggs and a few slices of toast in front of him. He looked at them the way someone might look at something they've only seen from afar. Then, slowly, he picked up the fork and began to eat, small bites, careful and quiet. We sat there in a soft silence, not awkward, but gentle, like we both knew this morning was not something either of us had ever made a habit of holding on to. When Sam finished eating, I stood, reached for my coat, and said, "You can stay here another night. Just tonight. I won't ask questions, not unless you want to tell me." Sam looked up, his eyes still carrying that careful wariness, but I saw something shift behind them, a flicker of relief. He nodded. That afternoon, I took Sam for a walk through the neighborhood, not for distraction, but so he wouldn't feel hidden away. We stopped by a small corner grocery, where the older woman behind the counter looked at Sam, then at me, her expression cautious and searching. I didn't explain. I simply turned to Sam and asked what he'd like to drink. He chose an orange juice. I bought a few snacks, some small clothes that looked like they might fit, and we headed back to the apartment. Sam never let his backpack out of reach, not for a moment. I didn't push him. I understood some things, no matter how worn or frayed, are the only threads that tie a person to the memory of where they come from. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner, and as I watched Sam sitting across from me, a spoon in his hand, I realized I hadn't shared a meal with anyone in years. My dinners had always been solitary, eaten in front of a glowing screen or inside a closed conference room. But tonight, something about the apartment had changed. Not warmth exactly, but the emptiness had softened, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't echo. It simply let us be. After dinner, Sam asked in a quiet voice, "Do you know any place that takes kids without papers?" The question stopped me cold, not because I didn't have an answer, but because a 6-year-old should never have to ask it. I replied softly, "I don't know right now, Sam, but I'll find out. I promise." He nodded, then once again pulled Brownie from his backpack and placed the bear beside his pillow as he climbed into bed. I stood at the doorway, watching as he tucked himself under the blanket, the soft amber glow of the nightlight casting warmth across a face still far too young for such worry. "Just tonight, okay?" His voice called out just as I was turning to leave. I paused, turned back, and said, "Yes, just tonight." But I knew in my heart that one night would never be enough. I had once thought I was simply helping a child through a single evening, but the truth was, I was the one being led into a path from which I couldn't turn back. I returned to the office, turned on the lamp, and opened the old Shelter Street files, not this time to find what had gone wrong, but to search for what might still be possible. In the stillness, I could hear Sam's steady breathing from the other room, and I found myself thinking that sometimes everything begins with just one simple sentence. Let him stay, just for tonight. And sometimes it's those smallest things that open doors we once believed had been locked for good. The next morning, while Sam was still fast asleep, I stepped quietly out of the apartment, the worn scrap of paper he had once shown me folded in my pocket. On it was a handwritten note from his mother, along with an address for a small clinic in the southern part of the city. It was the only clue I had, and the only reason I needed to stop hesitating. The air was crisp, the early wind threading through the streets and stirring the edges of my coat. I walked faster as I neared the old neighborhood, where signs had faded with time and shop fronts opened with a quiet sort of endurance, not meant to attract attention but simply to survive. The Thames Ive clinic stood between a shuttered barber shop and a tired corner store. The sign on the door was so plain it looked forgotten. I pushed the door open. A soft chime rang overhead. Inside was a small waiting area, warmer than I'd expected. A few fabric-covered chairs, their patterns worn from years of use, a shelf with scattered health magazines, and an unattended front desk. A few moments later, a woman in her early 50s stepped out from the back room, dressed in a nurse's uniform, still holding a thermometer in one hand. She looked surprised to see me, but her eyes stayed calm, steady. I stepped forward and asked gently, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm trying to find information about someone named Gloria. I don't know her full name, but she once brought her son here for treatment, maybe a few months ago." I reached into my coat pocket and held out the worn scrap of paper, hoping this small thread might unravel something more. The nurse looked at me, then down at the paper. After a few quiet seconds, she nodded. Gloria. I remember now. A young woman, very thin, always wore an old coat, and she always had a little boy with her blonde hair, bright eyes. She motioned for me to sit, and I did. The room grew quieter somehow as she began to speak. Gloria came here 3 times. The first time was for the flu. The second, she fainted from overwork. The last time, I asked her if she had anyone to call, anyone who could help. She shook her head and said that as long as she was with her son, everything would be okay. But that last visit, I could tell she didn't have much strength left. I asked, "Do you know what happened after that?" The nurse shook her head, her eyes briefly clouding. After that last appointment, she never came back. We tried calling the number she left on the intake form, but no one ever answered. When I asked whether there was any full name or a listed address, she stood and disappeared into the back room, then returned with a paper file in her hands. On the cover, written in faint ink, was a name, Gloria Sandoval. The listed address was for a rental complex on the outskirts of the city, a place I remembered for its narrow hallways and clusters of low-income families just trying to hold on. I thanked her and stood to leave. But before I could walk out, she stopped me. "Are you family?" she asked. I hesitated. "No, but the boy, he's with me now, and I need to know how to help him not feel like the world has forgotten him." The nurse looked at me for a long moment, then simply said, "Gloria loved her son more than anything in this world. She used to say that if there was someone out there kind enough to hold her son's hand when she couldn't anymore, then that would be the greatest gift life could ever offer." I left the clinic with a piece of paper bearing Gloria's full name and her old address, but more than that, I left with a memory passed down through someone who had quietly witnessed her. Strength. A mother who had lived quietly, ailing but fiercely with everything she had left. And as I stepped out into the street, the wind still cut sharp through the dusk air, but something in me felt clearer than it had in a long time. Her name was Gloria. And the boy sleeping in my apartment was not an anonymous child. He was the son of a woman who had loved him with every breath she had left. And perhaps, just perhaps, I had been chosen to carry that love forward. Belated, yes, but never too late. I returned to the apartment as twilight began to settle, a copy of Gloria's medical file in one hand and a slip of paper with her old address in the other. Sam was sitting at the table, carefully lining up broken crayons in a neat row. When he looked up and saw me, his eyes held that same guarded look I had come to recognize, but this time, something in them softened when I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Today, I found out your mother's name, Gloria." He didn't speak. He just pressed his lips together, a silent response that felt deeper than words. And I also learned that there were people who tried to help her, but the system didn't. That sentence hung between us, like a truth that needed to be said, even if it wasn't easy to hear, even if it hurt to admit, even for me. After Sam had gone to bed, I sat down at my desk and reopened the company's internal system, tracing the application code listed in Gloria's medical file. It didn't take long to find it. Gloria had once submitted a request for housing and medical assistance through a community fund affiliated with Crestview. Her request had been denied. The reason, as recorded in the system, was a missing verified residency code and mismatched identification data. She had used her maiden name, the name from before marriage, but lacked legal documents proving her relationship to her son. In the notes section, a cold, unyielding sentence had been typed, unable to verify legal eligibility. Request denied. I sat motionless. Those seemingly reasonable protocols, those requirements for complete documentation, the tightly wound approval procedures, those were the very things that had slammed the door shut in the face of a sick woman and a child who needed protection. And it was all the more painful when I saw the final sign-off came from the finance department I oversaw directly. I couldn't remember ever reading her file. Perhaps it had passed through one of the automated systems, reviewed, sorted, and rejected with a click, one of hundreds that week. But no matter the method, the truth remained. I was responsible. I kept digging. After her support request was denied, Gloria had contacted Shelter Street, hoping for a place in temporary housing. But by that time, the center had already begun shutting down in phases due to budget cuts. Not enough beds, not enough staff, and once again, a door closed before someone who had nowhere else to go. I sat in the group, dark, no lights on, only the glow of the screen casting its pale light across my face. I had once believed I was running an efficient system where every process was optimized, every resource allocated with precision. But I had never stopped to look at the human beings behind the denied requests. I had never asked, what happens if we're wrong? A clipped headline popped up in my search results, an old news article reporting on the closure of several community programs. It included a brief statement from a company spokesperson, explaining that the restructuring was necessary for long-term financial sustainability. I read it line by line, my skin prickling with unease. The language, calm and detached, had come from my own communications team, crafted according to the outline I had approved. Neutral tone, no emotion, designed to pacify public reaction. But now, I understood. That same language, sterile, polished, could also be the thing that quietly extinguished hope. When it's used to justify indifference, it becomes a weapon cloaked in reason. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for our internal legal department. I requested full access to all rejected support applications from the past 3 years, where the reason cited was insufficient personal documentation. The voice on the other end hesitated, then asked for clarification. I repeated myself firmly. This is urgent. I need to know how many times the system I built has done what it did to Gloria, and how many others like her never had the chance to come back. That night, I did not sleep. I sat alone in the dim light, staring at a list of nameless people glowing on the screen before me. Each name was a plea unheard, an effort dismissed, a cry for help that never made it to another human ear. And I realized then, with a kind of hollow clarity, that the numbers I had once been proud of were now the deepest wounds I carried. Not because the data had been wrong, but because I had let it speak for me for far too long. In a world where justification often outruns compassion, even the smallest error in paperwork could be the reason someone is left behind. And I, who once believed I was running a fair, rational system, had to finally face a truth that no language could soften. That system had pushed a sick, exhausted mother to vanish in silence, and it had left a child carrying his entire world in a worn-out canvas bag simply because one form wasn't filled out properly. That morning, I woke Sam with a voice gentler than usual. He opened his eyes, a flicker of caution crossing his face, then fading when he saw me sitting beside the bed, my hand resting on the edge. I told him we needed to go somewhere today, a place that might help me figure out the best way to care for him. Sam didn't speak. He just nodded, quietly. Still clutching his backpack as if it were part of his own body, he went into the bathroom, brushed his teeth, washed his face calm, composed, like a small adult who had long learned how to tend to himself. On the way to the Department of Family Services, Sam sat beside me in the passenger seat, hands gripping the straps of his backpack held tightly in his lap. From time to time, he looked out the window, not with the wide curiosity of a child exploring the world, but with the watchfulness of someone who's been left behind too many times to relax. The building was a grey concrete mass, its small windows and long fluorescent-lit corridors drained of warmth. We walked in without speaking. The waiting room was filled with cold plastic chairs lined against the wall. Some people sat in silence. Some held their heads low. A young mother rocked her crying baby with tired arms. A man in his 60s sat beside a little girl holding 2 small bags of clothes. A teenager in a hoodie stared at the floor, his eyes red-rimmed, saying nothing. It felt like walking into a train station without an operator, just rows of people waiting for something uncertain, something invisible, something that might not come. Sam sat next to me, his legs swinging gently, his gaze still and unreadable like the surface of a lake just before rain. He didn't ask where we were, didn't ask how long we would stay. He only pulled his backpack closer to his chest. I rested my hand on his shoulder, and I felt him tense, just slightly. A social worker stepped out from behind the heavy door inside, calling my name from the appointment list. I stood up and took Sam's hand. He rose and followed, step by small step, not making a sound. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of what we had both brought into that building, not just a name or a form or a case number, but a story neither of us could carry alone anymore. The office was a square room, plain and quiet, with nothing but a table, a few chairs, and a small stack of papers spread across the desk. The woman seated behind it was named Karen, somewhere in her early 40s, her face firm but not unkind. She invited us to sit, then opened the file in front of her. After a few procedural questions, she looked at me directly and asked, clearly and without hesitation, "Mr. Monroe, do you have any legal relationship to this child?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I just found him in a difficult situation, and I thought I should bring him here to find help." Karen nodded. She wasn't surprised. She'd heard versions of this story before. Then she spoke again, her voice calm but certain. "According to regulation, if there is no legal guardian, the child will be placed into temporary protective care within 24 hours. We'll do everything we can to ensure he's placed in a safe and supportive environment." I turned to Sam. He was looking up at me, unblinking. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw fear flash clearly across his eyes. I didn't know how much he could understand from our conversation, but I knew he understood one thing: separation. And this time, he knew it could be forever. Karen continued, "If you want to keep the child in your care, you can apply for temporary guardianship, but the process takes time. He can't remain with you until there is an official order in place." I heard every word like the edge of a blade sliding deeper into me. Not because I didn't understand the law, but because now the law stood between a child and the only person who had promised not to leave him behind. Sam tugged at my sleeve. I leaned down. He spoke so softly it almost didn't reach me, his voice trembling on the edge of breaking. "If they take me, will you come back for me?" I couldn't answer right away. I just held his small, shaking hand inside mine. I turned to Karen, my voice lower, steadier than I expected. "Is there any way I can keep him? At least until a decision is made?" She studied me for a long moment. The resolve in her eyes softened. She asked, "Are you sure you want to go down this road? It's not easy." I answered with something I hadn't even rehearsed. "I'm not sure about the road, but I'm sure this boy shouldn't spend tonight alone in a cold room somewhere." Karen looked down at the file again, then slid a document across the table. "Fill this out," she said, "and prepare yourself for a full background check and home review." I took the form into my hands. Before leaving, I looked back at her. "Thank you," I said. "Not for helping me, but for not closing your eyes to a child about to be swept into a system we've all made colder than any winter." When we stepped back into the waiting room, Sam gripped my hand tighter. He didn't say a word, but his steps were steadier, as if, for the first time in his life, he no longer felt like the forgotten one in a waiting room full of unfinished promises. As we left the social services office, I felt Sam's small hand clinging tighter to mine than ever before. He walked so close beside me that his tiny steps nearly brushed against the fabric of my pants, as if any space between us might be enough for the world to slip in and pull him away. The sky outside hung heavy with grey. The wind scraped across our faces, biting cold, sharp enough to sting. I looked down and saw him pressing his lips into a thin line, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if willing himself not to cry. We didn't speak, not until we got into the car. I locked the doors, and slowly the warmth inside the cabin began to soften the chill from outside. Sam sat still, his hands gripping the straps of his old backpack, resting it on his lap. His eyes were fixed on the window, staring into a space only he could see. I waited. I didn't rush him. Then suddenly he turned toward me, and his small, dark eyes trembled. "Uncle Ethan," he whispered, like a dry branch stirring in the wind, "if they take me, will you come find me?" The question struck something deep inside me, the kind of ache that no amount of preparation could soften. I had known this moment would come, but I hadn't expected it to hit so hard, so precisely. Sam wasn't crying. He was just looking at me, with the eyes of a child who had grown used to promises left unfinished. I drew in a slow, heavy breath and placed my hand over his. "Sam," I said quietly, "I already told you. I'm not going to leave you." But still he didn't look away. His eyes were searching, trying to decide whether I was speaking from comfort or conviction. And I understood. Trust, for a child who had watched the world walk away too many times, is not given lightly. I started the engine but didn't pull away. The low hum filled the space between us, a silence thick enough to feel. Sam lowered his head, and his voice came even softer, like something pulled from a memory too fragile to hold up on its own. "My mum used to say, if someone really loved me, they'd stay. But everyone leaves." That sentence made me turn and look at him, long and hard. Because behind those quiet words was a wound, one that had closed over, but had never, not once, stopped hurting. I reached over and gently adjusted his seatbelt. The gesture made him look up at me. "I'm staying," I said. "No matter how hard this road gets, I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, Sam reached out and took my hand, tightly, very tightly, as if letting go meant losing something he couldn't survive losing again. I let him hold on. I felt the tiny tremors in his palm, not from the cold, but from the fear that had lived too long inside him. I pulled the car slowly onto the road, heading back toward the small apartment that had started to feel a little less empty. All the way home, Sam kept his hand in mine, his eyes staring straight ahead, as if needing to check again and again that I was still there, still beside him, still not changing my mind. When we arrived back at the Tekti apartment, Sam stayed close to me, removing his shoes and scarf without letting go of my hand for more than a moment. I placed his backpack gently on the sofa. Then, as if the fear had been waiting just beneath his breath, he suddenly blurted out, his voice tight, uncertain. "You won't let them take me, right?" I knelt down to meet his gaze, placing my hand gently on his small shoulder. "Sam," I said, "I'll do everything I can so you're not taken away alone. But I need you to trust me." He looked at me for a long time, eyes flicking over every word, as if trying to read not just my face, but my intentions. Then he gave a small nod. It was barely a movement, but it held the weight of something deep, something earned. That evening, I called Karen and told her I was beginning the process of applying for temporary guardianship. She was quiet for a moment, perhaps unsurprised. Then she said the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time. I said, I understood, but nothing in my life had ever felt as certain as this. After I hung up, I returned to the living room. Sam was curled up on the sofa, holding Brownie close, eyes half shut, but not yet asleep. I walked over and pulled the blanket over him. He opened his eyes, just slightly, and asked one last question before drifting off. "You're still here, right?" I whispered. "Right here, Sam." He closed his eyes, one small hand gripping the edge of my shirt as if it were an anchor against the tides that had swept him away too many times before. And in that quiet moment, I realized that stepping into this child's life hadn't been a sudden impulse. It had been inevitable. Like a door that had remained shut for years, now slowly creaking open, not just for him, but for me too. From that moment on, I was no longer just the man who helped Sam through one night. I had become the person he reached for, the one he asked not to leave, and I knew I had answered him with the rest of my life. Just a few days after submitting the guardianship paperwork, life inside the apartment, still quiet, still new, shifted in a direction I hadn't expected. That morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone began vibrating relentlessly. Messages, emails, missed calls from unfamiliar numbers. At first, I assumed it was a crisis at the office. But when I opened a link sent by an old colleague, I understood what was happening. It was a video, less than 2 minutes long. Footage from the hallway of the social services office, showing the moment I knelt beside Sam, held his hand as he asked in a trembling voice if I would come find him if they took him away. And I told him I wouldn't let him go alone. Someone, a woman waiting nearby, had captured it on her phone and uploaded it to social media. The title read, "A stranger keeps his promise to the boy no one wanted." Overnight, the video had gone viral. It was everywhere, shared across platforms, reposted by news outlets and celebrities alike. People didn't care who I was. All they saw was a child on the edge of the system and a man in a grey coat kneeling beside him, making a promise that cracked something open in them. The comment sections filled quickly, thousands of stories. People said they'd been a child like Sam. Others wrote they had spent their whole lives waiting for someone to say those exact words. Some called it a moment that melted America's collective heart. And then, inevitably, came the questions. Who was the man? I didn't use social media often, so I reached out to Mia, a former communications intern, to help me understand the scale of what was unfolding. She came to my apartment that afternoon, carrying a laptop and a look that was half astonishment, half concern. She showed me articles, video reactions, pages of coverage, people digging, speculating, trying to put a name to the man in the clip. Mia looked at me carefully. "They'll know. Soon enough, Ethan. Finding the face of a CEO isn't hard. And when they do, they'll ask why the man who once approved budget cuts for community programs is now holding the hand of a homeless child in a government hallway." They won't stop until they get an answer. I sat in silence. I wasn't afraid of being found out. I was afraid of the light, the attention, the way a spotlight, no matter how well intended, can turn a child into a symbol, something to be passed around, admired, and forgotten when the next story comes along. All I wanted was to protect Sam, quietly, without applause. But that silence had already been broken. The clip was real, the words were real, that hand in mine that was real, and so was the story behind it. Even if it wasn't as pretty or simple as the world now wanted it to be. That evening, I sat down with Sam. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting to be filled with something important. I told him that, in the coming days, there might be people on television talking about me, that they might ask questions about me, and maybe even about him. Sam looked at me without blinking. Then he asked, his voice soft and unsure, "Are they going to take me away because you did something wrong before?" The question caught in my throat. I felt the weight of every choice I had made pressing against my chest. I told him, quietly, that I didn't know what might happen. But I knew one thing for certain. No one could take him away if he didn't want to go. And as long as I was still here, I would keep that promise. He nodded slowly. Then, just as he had that day in the car, Sam reached for my hand. This time, his grip wasn't trembling. It was steady, certain, trusting. And in that moment, I knew something deeper than all the analysis and justifications I had lived by for decades. That no matter how many headlines were written, no matter how thoroughly my past decisions were dissected, no matter what people believed about who I was or wasn't, there was one thing no one could undo. The moment a child believed someone would stay, and that someone didn't walk away. Whether or not a camera had caught it, that moment was real. And sometimes, one real moment is enough to change not only how others see us, but how we begin to see ourselves. The next morning, Mia returned this time with a look on her face that was sharper, more urgent than before. She brought her laptop, setting it down on the table with a quiet resolve. I stood by the window, watching the early light spread thin across the misted rooftops of the city. Behind me, the apartment was still. Sam was still asleep, curled around his stuffed bear like every dream had finally given him permission to rest. Mia opened her laptop, turned the screen toward me. On it was a draft of a statement, simple but unflinching. The title read, "I'm the man in the video, and this is the truth." I stared at those words for a long while, saying nothing. Mia pulled out a chair, sat down, her voice calm but firm. "Ethan, they're going to find out who you are. They'll know what position you held, what budgets you cut, what programs you signed off on, and when that happens, you can't stay silent." I didn't argue. She was right. But what made me hesitate wasn't the fact that the truth would come out. It was how it would be told. People would see the contradiction. A man who once shut the doors of a shelter, now holding the hand of a child who had nowhere else to go. They would call it hypocrisy, a late-stage redemption arc, or worse, a performance. Mia went on, her voice no longer that of a former intern or a distant colleague. She spoke like someone who had once believed in me, and perhaps still did. "You don't have to justify yourself, but you do need to speak. Speak the whole story. Why Shelter Street closed, why cases like Sam's mother were turned away, and why now? You're choosing to stay. If you don't, others will tell it for you. And that version won't be the truth." I stood there, still facing the window, as her words settled behind me like dust, finding its way into the corners of a room. And I realized, slowly, that this story, my story, was no longer just mine to carry in silence, because somewhere out there, someone like Sam was still waiting outside a locked door, holding a backpack full of dreams and hoping, against all odds, that someone would finally turn the handle and let them in. I sat down at the table and opened the draft Mia had written. Line by line, the words unfolded like a mirror. There was no varnish, no evasion. It began with an admission that I had once been a CEO who believed in efficiency, in numbers, in the rationale behind every cut made, that I truly thought I was doing the right thing for the organization. But it was also me who failed to see the face of Gloria, who never heard the voices of children like Sam. That I was not proud of the things I had overlooked, but I would no longer deny them. Mia hadn't written this to excuse me. She had written it so I could stand upright without hiding behind a lie. I looked at her and asked quietly, "Are you sure this is the right thing?" Her eyes didn't waver. "I'm not sure it'll get you forgiveness," she said. "But if you don't speak, you're turning your remorse into silence. And for someone like Sam, silence is just another way of leaving." I understood then that some truths can't be mended with words, but they still need to be spoken, because if you don't speak them, someone else will shape them in your absence. I thought about Sam, about that first night he slept on the couch in my apartment, his eyes wide with doubt, as if he were counting every breath to see if I'd disappear. I thought about the question he whispered, the one that stayed with me even in sleep. "Are you going to stay?" And I knew, to truly stay, I couldn't keep living as a shadow. I returned to the statement, adjusted a few sentences, and added something at the end. "I'm not telling this story to be praised. I'm telling it because a child believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and I cannot betray that trust again." I sent the final version to Mia. She read it once, twice, and then nodded. "You know, Ethan," she said, "I used to think you were the coldest person I'd ever worked with. But today, I realize that sometimes the coldest people are carrying something they've never had the chance to say out loud." We sat in silence for a moment, a brief calm before the inevitable storm of public reaction. But this time, I wasn't avoiding it. Not because I wanted absolution, but because Sam deserved to know that change was real, and that it doesn't begin with perfection. It begins with the courage to speak the truth. The conference room on the 18th floor of Crestview had always been colder than the rest of the building, not just because of the air conditioning, but because of what the room represented. Power, detachment, numbers without context. Handshakes that sealed decisions with unspoken consequences. That morning, I walked in differently than I ever had before. No briefcase, no quarterly reports. Just a man walking into the heart of a system he once believed he could control entirely. Victor was already seated at the head of the table. The same dark suit, pressed to perfection, no crease out of place. His eyes, sharp as knives sheathed in velvet, watched me without a flicker of warmth. A few members of the board sat beside him, nodding at me with the barest courtesy. No one offered a handshake. No one smiled. The door closed behind me with a soft click, a sound that felt more like a warning than a welcome. I took my seat. Victor wasted no time. "What do you think you're doing, Ethan?" His voice was low, even, stripped of all emotion. I met his gaze. "I'm telling the truth. About what happened. About the people our system failed. People who never stood a chance because we built something that saw through them instead of seeing them." Another board member interrupted, voice laced with derision. "That boy isn't our fault. And we can't be expected to carry the weight of every rejected application just because someone didn't know how to fill out a form." I leaned forward, steady but firm. "And who designed that form? Who built the process so airtight, so impenetrable that no one could question a denial?" Victor raised a hand to stop me. "Enough. Ethan, what you're doing out there is tanking our stock. The media's digging through our archives like vultures. And now, you've made yourself the face of a rebellion against the very company you're supposed to be leading. This isn't noble. It's betrayal." I stayed quiet for a moment, then answered more calmly than I expected. Maybe you're right, but if saving one child makes me a traitor, then I'll betray you again. The air in the room turned to stone. Another board member spoke. You do realize we can call a vote of no confidence. We have the numbers to remove you. I nodded. I know. And I didn't come here to beg for my position. I came to tell you I'm no longer the man you can use to rubber-stamp decisions built on profit alone. I used to be, but not anymore. I've seen what the consequences look like. Not on a balance sheet, but in the eyes of a child. Victor leaned back, arms crossed. So what's your plan? Turn Crestview into a charity? No, I said. I plan to make Crestview a company with a conscience, a company that doesn't turn its back on the communities it promised to serve. And if that costs me this job, I accept it. But I won't go back to being someone who bows to a spreadsheet and calls it duty. Silence pressed down on the room like a closing door. No applause, no rebuttal, just the cold weight of a choice that couldn't be undone. I stood and left the room without waiting for the meeting to be officially adjourned. As the door shut behind me, I felt colder than I ever had, not because of the air conditioning, but because I had just walked out from under the shadow I had lived in for half my life. And even if what lay ahead was a fight, at least this time, I knew what I was fighting for. Not reputation, not image, but a small promise I had made to a boy on a winter afternoon, that I would stay. And staying meant standing in that frigid room and saying what no one wanted to hear, for someone who didn't yet have a voice strong enough to speak for himself. The second meeting was scheduled just 3 days after that first confrontation. The email arrived in the morning without any detailed agenda, only a single sentence requesting my punctual attendance to explain personal direction before the board of directors. I knew this wasn't a discussion anymore. This was a verdict, a room where it would be decided whether I'd continue occupying a seat I had held for nearly a decade. But what kept my hands from trembling that morning had nothing to do with the title I might lose. It came from a decision I had made quietly over 2 long nights. That day, I didn't arrive alone. As I stepped into the elevator, I glanced down at Sam. He wore a small blue coat and clutched Brownie tight to his chest. "You sure you want to do this?" I asked. Sam nodded without hesitation. His eyes no longer carried that constant flicker of worry. He looked up at me and said, "If they need to see the truth, then I should be part of it, right?" I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, and I'm very proud of you." The boardroom doors opened. Heads turned as I entered with a child by my side. Victor's brow immediately furrowed. "Ethan, what is this?" he snapped. I walked directly to the head of the table, where the CEO's chair still waited, and pulled an extra chair next to it for Sam. I didn't sit right away. Instead, I remained standing, meeting each face in the cold room one by one. I didn't start with numbers or justifications. I began with Gloria. I spoke of the errors in her paperwork, the cost-saving decisions that had quietly pushed a sick mother beyond the edges of safety. I spoke of Sam, of the boy who had slept beside the locked doors of a shelter once funded by this company and then quietly defunded. I spoke not to assign guilt, but to remind them of something simple and long forgotten. Behind every figure on a spreadsheet is a human being. Victor interrupted. "This is not the place for personal stories." I looked directly at him. "And it's because we've never made room for personal stories that we've come to this. If a child can be left behind by a signature, then the system has cracks. And if protecting that child is considered a liability, then we've strayed too far from where we were meant to go." I motioned to Sam. He stood slowly, a little unsure, but held my hand tightly. I leaned down and whispered, "Just speak the truth." Sam nodded. He looked up at the room full of strangers and spoke in a small, steady voice. "I don't know much about this company, but my mom came here once. she cried when no one answered. I slept outside the door because no one opened it. But Mr. Ethan was the first person who sat next to me. He didn't ask for papers. He didn't ask my name. He just stayed. And that changed everything. The air in the room shifted. Silence fell like a curtain. Sam looked around at the people seated before him, not with blame, but with a quiet, aching sadness. Then he turned to me and whispered, I said what I needed to, right? I nodded and wrapped my arm around his shoulder. You did great. Turning back to the board, I spoke one final time. You're free to vote however you wish. I'm not holding on to this chair for power. I just want to preserve some part of our humanity in how we lead. And if this company no longer values that, then perhaps I no longer belong here. Then Gerald spoke. He was one of the senior board members, long considered neutral, quiet, rarely offering more than a nod. He cleared his throat and looked up. I've been on this board a long time, he said, and this might be the first time I've ever seen a CEO bring a child into a boardroom. But it's also the first time I've remembered why we exist beyond just making money. The silence that followed no longer carried the chill it once had. It was the quiet of something beginning to shift. However slow, however fragile, it was real. As I left the meeting room with Sam, our hands still clasped together, I knew we hadn't won everything. But at least today, we had made those walls listen. And sometimes, change begins with a small hand reaching for a larger one, then stepping together into a room that never quite felt like it belonged to us. Yet somehow, we managed to leave behind a mark that would not easily fade. The courtroom that day was smaller than I had imagined. There were no crowded rows of benches, no buzzing press, only a space so still that every small sound seemed to echo. Wooden chairs, white walls, and light filtering through the tall windows cast everything in a clarity that reached even the darkest corners. I sat beside Sam, holding his hand, while my attorney spoke with the judge. Karen was there too, quiet in the back row, her eyes filled with both worry and compassion. I could feel Sam's breathing, slower than usual, not because he was sleepy, but because he was trying to stay calm. His small hand gently tightened around mine, just like he always did when he needed to know I was still there. The judge was a middle-aged woman named Lena, her silver hair falling loosely along her cheeks and her voice soft but steady. She didn't look at us like numbers in a file. She looked at us like people. When she invited Sam to come forward, I leaned down and whispered into his ear, "You don't have to worry. Just answer what you know, all right?" Sam nodded, then slowly walked to the stand. His small feet hesitated just a little as every eye in the room turned toward him, but then he stood tall, his gaze fixed on Lena. The judge smiled. "Hello there. Can you tell me your name?" Sam swallowed gently, then answered in a quiet voice. "My name is Sam," Lena continued. "And your last name?" "Sam." The boy paused. A silence passed through the room that nearly stopped my heart. Sam looked around, blinking a little faster. Then he shook his head. "I don't know. My mum just called me Sam. Nobody ever used a last name." In that moment, the entire room seemed to fall still, not because of an error in paperwork, but because that answer carried a truth colder than any fact. A 6-year-old child, unable to recall his last name, simply because no one had ever used it. No school, no forms, no person close enough to tie him to a family name. Just Sam. Judge Lena didn't push. She leaned slightly forward, her voice even gentler. "Who did you live with before you came here?" Sam answered. "My mum. We used to stay in a small room. But then my mum got sick, and we had to leave." Lena nodded. "Who do you live with now?" Sam turned to look at me. "With Uncle Ethan." The judge followed his gaze, then asked again, "Do you want to keep living with him?" Sam was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I do. because he doesn't leave me, and he makes good breakfast. That last sentence drew a quiet ripple of laughter across the courtroom, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Even the judge smiled. She turned to me. "Mr. Monroe, is there anything you would like to say before I make a temporary ruling?" I stood up, my heart still heavy with Sam's words. I didn't speak long. "Your Honor, I'm not here to prove I'm a good father. I've never been one, and there's a lot I still need to learn. But I do know one thing. Sam deserves someone who doesn't walk away halfway through. And I want to be that person." Lena nodded. She wrote down a few lines, then said, "The court approves Mr. Ethan Monroe as the temporary guardian of the minor known as Sam, whose full last name is currently undetermined. This decision will remain in effect until further guidance is provided by child services and the identity records are completed. But," she paused, turning her eyes to Sam, "would you like to choose a temporary last name for yourself?" Sam looked at me, then turned back and said, "I'm just Sam, just Sam." And Lena smiled once more. "All right then, just Sam. One more thing. Do you know why I asked you all those questions?" Sam shook his head. She leaned in, lowering herself to his eye level. "Because everyone deserves to be called by their name. Because when you know who you are, you will never feel lost again." I stepped forward, took Sam's hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. And as we stepped out of the courtroom, the sunlight coming through the doorway felt like a quiet period at the end of a hearing with no tears, no dramatics, just a child standing among adults and, for the first time, being heard. On the way out of the courthouse, Sam didn't say much. He just walked beside me in silence, his small hand resting inside mine like a new habit, one that had already settled into the rhythm of our breath. We walked down the old stone sidewalk, and the noise of traffic in the distance seemed held back by a strange hush that lived between the two of us. I leaned down and asked, "Are you okay?" Sam nodded, then looked up at me. "Were you nervous when you stood in front of the judge?" I smiled gently. "Of course. But I think what matters is not being unafraid, but standing there even when you are." Sam was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Like when you sat with me on Shelter Street." I turned to him. "Yes, just like that." And for the first time all morning, Sam smiled. That afternoon, we stopped by a small park near where I lived. It was quiet, with a few wooden benches and trees stripped bare by the end of winter. Sam chose a bench beneath one of those dry branches, sat swinging his legs, and held Brownie the teddy bear tightly to his chest. I sat beside him, leaving space for him to speak if he wanted to. After a while, Sam turned to me. "Uncle Ethan, if someone asks why I want to live with you, what should I say?" I looked at him, unsure where the question had come from. "You just need to tell the truth, that's all." Sam thought for a moment, then nodded. "Then I guess I'll say, because you stayed." That answer tightened something in my chest. Not because it was carefully said or polished, but because it was so painfully simple. Not because I was wealthy, not because I was famous, not because I was the best person, but just because I didn't walk away. In Sam's life, perhaps something as small as that was enough to change everything he understood about love, about trust, about what family meant. And I realized it wasn't any statement or effort in that meeting room or anything said in the media that connected me to this boy. It was one simple thing that far too many adults had failed to do. I stayed. That night, I called my lawyer to confirm the next steps. Temporary guardianship could last up to 6 months, followed by the formal adoption process if no biological relatives came forward. I knew what lay ahead was a long road filled with regulations, evaluations, and interviews, and strangely, for the first time in years, the weight of all that didn't feel heavy. I wanted to take each step, not to prove anything, but because I had chosen this path, with Sam walking beside me. After a simple dinner of vegetable soup, which Sam seemed to be growing increasingly fond of, the boy sat quietly scribbling in the small notebook I had bought for him. I asked, "What are you writing?" Sam handed it to me. On the page, in uneven, crooked letters, was a single sentence: "Family is where people don't leave each other behind." I closed the notebook and handed it back to him. "I think that's a very good definition." Sam leaned his head against my arm. "So now you're my family, right?" I didn't answer right away. I placed my hand gently on his head, smoothing the fine strands of hair. "Yes, if that's what you want, then I am too." That night, just as I turned off the light and was stepping out of his room, Sam called out, "Uncle Ethan." I turned back. "You know, I don't remember my last name, but I'm not sad about that anymore." "Why not?" Sam pulled the blanket up to his chest, his voice barely more than a breath. "Because I have a name you'll never forget. That's enough." I stepped out, and the door clicked softly behind me, but didn't shut all the way. A sliver of light still shone through from the small bedroom, and I understood then that sometimes what makes a child choose to trust is not grand promises or soaring speeches, but quiet presence. To stay, to listen, to not turn away. Because in the darkest moments, the one thing that gives someone the courage to open their heart is knowing there's someone who won't leave when they're needed the most. And this time, I had stayed. On the first morning of that spring, I stood before the old iron gate on Shelter Street, the very place where months ago a small boy with a torn coat and a worn-out teddy bear had huddled against the cold wind. The gate, once sealed in silence, was now having its rusted lock removed, replaced with a freshly painted sign, its soft ivory background catching the gentle light of March. In deep green letters the words stood clear: "The Open Door House." No longer an abandoned shelter, no longer a place people stopped by only to turn their backs on. Tangled lives. Now, it was a different beginning, born from the only truth I had come to believe lately. When a door is opened, good things can find their way in. Sam stood beside me, his small backpack resting on his shoulders. He tilted his head slightly to look up at the sign, and though he said nothing, his eyes lit up. I knew that for him, this place wasn't just a building. It was memory, fear, the night he first met an adult who didn't walk away. And now, it was hope for other children like the one he used to be. Karen stepped out from inside, holding a folder of paperwork in her hands, and smiled brightly the moment she saw us. She was the first to agree to return to work at the reopened center, no longer as a contracted staffer from some tangled organization, but as someone who had decided to put her heart into every story that was about to unfold here. None of us called it a grand opening. There were just a few friends, a few volunteers, a handful of neighbors who had seen that door close too many times. But they came, not for ceremony. They came because the story had touched them, and they wanted to be part of this new chapter. Mia was there too, capturing moments with her small video camera, her eyes focused yet kind. She leaned toward me as she adjusted her lens and said softly, "You're not just reopening a shelter, Ethan. You're reopening this community's belief in things we thought couldn't be mended." Victor didn't come. I hadn't expected him to, but Mr. Gerald from the board did. He stood quietly in the back row, said little, but shook my hand firmly. He spoke only one short sentence, but it was one I will remember. "It's been a long time since I felt proud to say I'm part of this company." Then he turned and walked away, asking for no attention, as if his being there needed no announcement at all. Inside the center, the rooms had been repainted in soft, calming colors. New beds were freshly made. A small reading corner glowed under the warmth of golden lamplight, and one wall had been left blank, waiting for the drawings of the children who would soon arrive. Each room bore a name, not a number. One was named Gloria, in memory of a mother who never received help when she needed it most. Another was called Brownie, after Sam's teddy bear. I hadn't expected to feel moved by a small plaque next to a door, but when I saw that name, something stung behind my eyes, because it was a quiet reminder that every child carries something precious that deserves protection, even if it's just a worn-out toy. As the sun rose higher, Sam and I walked down the hallway, our footsteps echoing softly on the new wooden floor. I asked quietly, "What do you think of this place?" Sam didn't answer right away. He looked up at me, then turned his gaze to the row of rooms. Finally, he said, "Now, if someone asks me, I know where to send them." I smiled, resting my hand on his head. "That's right. And this time, the door won't close on anyone. A shelter isn't just a place for someone to stay. It's the first place that helps them believe they still matter." The open door house wasn't the ending of a journey toward redemption. It was the beginning of hundreds of new stories. And for me, it became the place where I learned a simple but lasting truth. That change doesn't come from perfection. It comes from a door opening at the right moment, and from a child brave enough to trust again. One Saturday morning, while Karen and I were unpacking a few boxes of newly donated books for the reading nook at the open door house, a car pulled up slowly in front of the gate. Not loudly, not drawing attention, but just enough to make me look up. The car door opened, and stepping out was none other than Brandon, who had once been Victor's right-hand man during the harshest budget cuts. He wore a plain T-shirt, carried a large cardboard box in both hands, and looked around like someone entering a place he had only known through financial reports. I walked out to greet him, surprised but not cold. Brandon nodded, his voice calm and measured. "I brought some toys from home. My daughter's grown now, and I thought maybe the kids here might like them." We didn't say much. I didn't ask why he had come, and I didn't ask for an explanation. I simply led him inside, showed him the donation area, and let him arrange the items himself. As he knelt to place each doll, each unopened Lego set, I noticed his hands trembling slightly. Not from exhaustion, but from something heavier. Perhaps it was shame, perhaps remorse. But what mattered most was that he was here. A week later, while I was guiding a group of new student volunteers through the routines of caring for the children, a familiar figure appeared at the doorway. Victor. The suit he had always worn was gone, replaced by a rolled-up shirt, and perhaps the strangest part was the small potted plant in his hands. I thought for a moment I was mistaken. He walked in without the usual air of authority, without noise, with a gait that felt slower, almost cautious. "Ethan," he said, "I heard you could use an extra pair of hands out in the yard." I didn't answer right away. I simply looked at him, searching for signs of performance, of pretended change. But I didn't see calculation. I saw fatigue and something that felt real. I nodded, pointing toward the back lot, where a small patch of soil was being cleared for a vegetable garden for the kids. Victor followed the direction I gave, never turning back. He bent down and began to work the earth, each careful stroke of the spade as if trying to replant something he had once allowed to wither. That afternoon, after everyone had gone, I brought 2 cups of water out to the garden. Victor sat on the stone steps, his shirt stained with dirt, sweat glistening on his forehead. He took the glass, drank a quiet sip, then sat in silence for a long while. "I used to think I was right," he said softly. "Right to treat emotions as distractions, right to believe numbers were the only things that could be trusted. But then, a boy who didn't remember his own last name, and a man who once walked into a meeting room with that boy and not a shred of warmth, made me realize I never truly understood the weight of the work I was doing. I said nothing. I simply sat beside him, listening. Brandon returned the following week, this time to officially sign up for the evening tutoring program. He stood at the front desk, awkward as he filled out the form that asked, "Reason for volunteering." He wrote a single, short line, Because I once did nothing. I don't believe that everyone changes. But I do believe this. Some people, when they reach the edge of their own understanding, will choose to take a different path, even if it's late. And sometimes, redemption doesn't come with apologies. It comes in hands stained with soil, in toys arranged with trembling fingers, and in eyes that no longer look away. The open-door house was never built on grand budgets or lofty declarations. It was built by people who once turned away, but chose to return. By people who never learned how to love properly, but are now learning, step by step. Because as Sam once said, family is where people don't leave each other behind. And now, I believe that a community can be a family like that too, if each person is willing to stay a little longer, to do just one more thing. Not to erase the past, but to begin again, from the very pieces that once broke apart. That late afternoon, after the last of the volunteers had left the open-door house, Sam and I stayed behind a little longer to tidy up. The light of the setting sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows of the two of us across the freshly mopped floor. Sam was arranging comic books on the shelf when he paused, turned to me with a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Uncle Ethan." His voice, he was soft, as if he didn't want to disturb the quiet that had settled all around us. "Is there still anyone left behind?" I didn't answer right away. That question wasn't really meant for me. It was a thought rising gently from somewhere deep inside him. I walked over, sat down beside Sam, and followed his gaze to the window, where a few small children were still playing in the fading light. "I don't know everything that's happening out there, Sam. Maybe there are still children waiting just like you once were. But I know one thing for sure. No one's going to be left behind. Not while I'm here." Sam looked at me again. There was still a flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he was testing whether I truly believed what I had just said. I smiled and brushed my hand gently through his hair. "I promise." "Not while I'm here, kiddo." That wasn't just a comfort offered to a child. It was a vow I had been making to myself every single day since the first time I heard that trembling voice outside that gate. A simple question so sharp it cut straight to the heart. When nobody wants us anymore, where do we go? And if there once was a door that shut, then now, there must be one that always stays open. Sam nodded. Then he turned back to his books, continuing to line them up as if that one answer had been enough to bring his heart back to stillness. I stood and stepped into the hallway, looking out toward the yard where the laughter of children rose bright and clear. A little girl ran toward me, waving. "I'm about to win, Uncle Ethan." I waved back, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. In the sound of children's laughter echoing through the fading light of day, I understood that sometimes all a child needs in order to keep going is one grown-up willing to stay. And this time, no one would be left behind, not while I'm here. On the first morning of spring, Sam and I stepped out of the small house beside the open-door house. The air was cool, with a gentle edge, but the soft golden sunlight had begun to settle lightly on our shoulders and in our hair, like time itself whispering that the long, frozen months had finally slipped into the past. Sam reached for my hand. That small hand, once trembling in the cold and fear, now felt warm and steady. Together we walked down the stone path, where the season's first blossoms had begun to open on either side, delicate hints of new life unfurling. Sam looked up, his face lit with a quiet smile. "Spring feels different this year, doesn't it?" I nodded. "It does. Very different. Not only because of the weather or the flowers, but because for the first time in years, I've come to understand the weight of a hand held out at just the right moment. Sometimes, what changes a life isn't a sweeping decision or a hard-won victory. It's a hand offered without hesitation, a quiet word, one person who chooses to stay when everyone else has already walked away. And one act like that, no matter how small, can soften the scars that time has etched into a child's soul. Sam's story is not the only story, but it stands as a reminder to us all that compassion is never a luxury. In a world that so often moves too fast, too cold, each of us has the power to be an open hand, a steady shoulder, or simply a door that stays open for someone who needs it most. If this story has stirred something deep within you, take a moment to subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Click like and share this video so more people can hear stories like this, stories that speak to the humanity we all carry, even when the world forgets to look. What did Ethan and Sam's journey awaken in you? Have you ever seen someone change because of kindness? Or perhaps you were the one who opened a door for someone else. We would be honored to read your reflections in the comments below. Your words help us keep sharing love, one quiet story at a time. Thank you for spending this time with Emotional Echoes. We wish you and your family good health, deep joy, and peace in every moment. We'll see you again soon with a new story, a new path, and another chance for the heart to be touched by something simple yet profoundly precious. Until next time, take care and goodbye.